What does it really mean to be worldly? What does it really mean to be worldly? What I want to do for you is to put in a good word for worldliness. Now, why would I want to do that? Well, I think this key biblical theme is something that Christians today have lost sight of. So what happened to worldliness? Well, the short answer, I think, is that in the first half of the 20th century, the church trivialized worldliness. We bundled worldliness into a list of behaviors that Christians were meant to avoid. So Christians won't be worldly if they don't smoke, if they don't drink alcohol, if they don't go to the cinema, the palace of darkness, if they don't listen to rock music, the devil's music, if men keep their hair short, women keep their skirts long, and the list goes on, then we wouldn't be worldly. Now, all of this added up to what I call a shallow legalism. And many actually were very wounded by the church because this became central to how the church thought we had to be in the world. And I would say over the last few decades, we've just decided to abandon the idea of worldliness altogether. And so we're in a stage right now where I think the church is not very well equipped at understanding what it means to be worldly. Now that's a disaster for the church, in the West especially, because worldliness, according to the Bible, is a formidable enemy. And that's why when you read the Bible, you see it gives a lot of attention to this very matter. One of the great enemies we face as the followers of Jesus is worldliness. And if we don't resist being worldly, there's going to be a negative impact on our spiritual life. So worldliness has the power to seriously weaken us as Christians. And when worldliness takes over the church, we lose our vitality. We lose our power. So what does it mean to be worldly? Well, a worldly church has become enculturated. This is a good synonym for the idea of worldliness. Enculturation is what happens when the church takes on the characteristics and norms of our society. And when the church does that, there's a blending in rather than a standing out. And to reverse or inverse what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, at that point, the world becomes the salt and light of the church rather than the other way around. We are meant to be the salt and light of the world. So when we're shaped more by our culture than we are by the life and reality of Christ, Christ in us, Christ our Lord, then we become worldly because we lose our distinctiveness as the followers of Jesus. So my working definition of what it means to be worldly goes like this. The church becomes worldly when we forget who we are because we forget who Christ is. Worldliness is Christ forgetfulness. And forgetting Christ, his glory, his wonder, all he is for the church, we then forget who we are as his people. So then we lose sight of the one who's at the center of the life of the church, the one we live for, the one we worship. Now, when you look through the ages of church history, what you see is that worldliness is always a recurring pattern. In every age, there have been different forms of worldliness. So God's people, through the ages, have always faced the temptation of being shaped more by culture than they are by Jesus. And every historical moment has its own unique danger to the church in terms of being worldly. So that means there's different forms of being worldly. And that's why we need to be vigilant and very aware in our moment of what worldliness is for our times. So if we ask, what's the pressure, what's the danger of worldliness today? I would say it's becoming a secularized church. Sociologists say today we live in the secular age. This is the great social experiment over the last few hundred years for the West to do life without God. We became secular. So the secular age has a set of commitments that go with this phenomenon. We're going to pick these up as we go along. So the secular age is the cultural colossus we face today. And it really is a formidable enemy. So if we're going to stand against the colossus, the might of the secular age, and boy is it mighty. It's such a pressure, such a force. If we're not going to give in to the secular age, we have to hear Christ's call to be an unworldly people. And frequently he calls us to that. Only then, when we hear this call, will we stand out with integrity as his followers. Will we have the distinctiveness of those who belong to Christ. So you hear this call of Christ to be unworldly expressed in John 17 verse 14. Jesus says to his disciples, which is us, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them. He's praying at this point to his Father. For they, my disciples, are not of the world any more than I am of the world. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. My people, my followers, need protecting. They, my disciples, are not of the world, even as I am not of it. So he says, sanctify them, set them apart, make them distinctive by the truth. Your word is truth. That's a call to be unworldly. Now, to withstand the pressure of worldliness in the secular age, we're going to need what C.S. Lewis wonderfully called the good infection. The good infection. This comes from mere Christianity. Jesus came to this world and became a man in order to spread to other men the kind of life he has by what I call good infection. Just after COVID, it's quite apt, isn't it? Good infection. Every Christian is to become a little Christ. The whole purpose of becoming a Christian is simply nothing else than to be a little Christ. That's the high calling God has put on each of our lives, to be a little Christ. And being a little Christ in the world is what stops us from being conformed to our culture, from being enculturated. And when we become a little Christ, the influence goes in the other direction. We, the church, Christians, are the salt and light of the world. We become the good infection and leave the impact of Christ upon our culture. And by doing that, we live the distinctive life he calls us to, not blending in, but standing out. So that's what we mean by the word worldliness, or being worldly. That's what it is. So yes, I said we trivialized being worldly out of existence from a whole set of legal prohibitions. And what we did then is we saw, hang on, a lot of these prohibitions aren't in the Bible, so we don't need to live by these. So we scrapped them. But in scrapping all the legal prohibitions that we thought were Christ's word to us, we didn't replace the idea of being worldly with something positive. When I say positive, it's never positive to be worldly, but a positive understanding of what the Bible really means by that. So what we did is just abandon it altogether. So if you look at the New Testament, the three great enemies, Paul and John list these, are the flesh, the devil, and the world. Most Christians today could give you some coherent answer, maybe on the flesh, but perhaps not so much. The devil, maybe, although we've largely ignored him too. On the world, I think many have almost nothing they could say coherently about this enemy. Yeah, so some people would justify becoming like the world as contextualization. And you're saying, how would I respond to that? Well, I think mission always involves a kind of contextualization. We have to understand the culture we're addressing with the gospel. And we have to use language that's appropriate to it. But I think it's possible for contextualization to be taken way too far. And actually, we just become like the culture as we try to reach them for the culture, for the gospel. So This is a really good question, and one we have to be very careful about. We might pick this up a bit more. When we think about contextualization, normally we think about it in terms of translation to make the gospel intelligible. But the contextualization of the gospel and of Christ's lordship truly transforms cultures. And I would say the West, for hundreds of years, was deeply, deeply shaped by Christ's lordship over every area of life. And it left the deepest mark on Europe. And that is an entirely good thing. And I would say that that was a result of lots of people in the church, in its various forms, who were being little Christ, a little Christ in the world. And that shaped the various establishments of Western civilization. Huge. So how are we faithful to what's often said in terms of the summary of John 17? We're in the world, but not of it. How do we stay faithful to that? I think part of the way we do that is understanding what the Bible really means by the world. And that's going to be our next mini talk, because I think many Christians really do misunderstand what the world is. But in terms of what Chris Wright's talking about, holistic mission, absolutely. But we have to make some careful distinctions, which we're going to get to in a moment. I would say there's many of them, but if you look at the Catholic Church from the 10th, maybe the 11th to the 15th, 16th century, this is called the centuries of Babylonian captivity, the Avignon papacy. It's bad. I mean, there is really, really serious compromises happening there. And a lot of it is a compromise of the church trying to take on the same kind of powers that nations had, with all the opulence and symbols of power that went with it. So when Luther comes along, the Reformation is very much his challenge to the worldliness of the church of his time. So that would be one of the big examples.